With dawn rising over the camp grounds, a faint layer of mist would settle across the area. It seemed to obscure the scale of what was happening, yet it could not conceal the reality that became increasingly evident to those on the other side of the barbed wire. The women's camp within the Auschwitz complex existed as a separate, tightly controlled section, where every detail followed a strict order. In this environment, nothing happened by chance. And yet, within such conditions, in early 1943, a sequence of events began to take shape that would later become a rare and almost unbelievable example of resistance. Among the prisoners who arrived at different times was a group of women whose technical skills and education allowed them to be assigned to industrial labor. These positions were dangerous and physically demanding, but they provided access to materials and equipment that, under different circumstances, could acquire an entirely new meaning. From 12 April 1943, a circle of prisoners gradually formed around the Union Munitions Factory located near the camp where ammunition production took place. Work in this facility required attention to every detail, since even small deviations could lead to serious consequences. The production process was organized in such a way that any misuse of materials was nearly impossible. The women worked under constant supervision in conditions that involved unstable substances and a high level of risk. Yet it was precisely this access to sensitive materials that created a potential link between forced labor and resistance. Any object that could be used beyond its intended purpose represented danger, and that danger was felt even when the prisoners were allowed to perform their tasks with a degree of autonomy. Inside the camp, information slowly spread about the construction of a crematorium nearby and about what happened during the night hours. Prisoners had no means of knowing the full extent or structure of events, but rumors and accidental observations painted a clearer picture than the authorities intended. Women working at the factory noticed changes, adjustments in security areas, the installation of new equipment, and the strengthening of guard routines. All this signaled that the situation inside the camp could shift at any moment, and those shifts would not favor the prisoners. The idea of resistance did not appear suddenly. It developed gradually, emerging from observations, fears, and occasional fragments of information reaching the women's camp from labor groups outside of it. Though few dared to speak openly about what they believed to be inevitable, some prisoners began to understand that inaction would only deepen the unfolding tragedy. Their understanding was not emotional. It was a careful analysis of changing security patterns, the behavior of guards, and subtle shifts in the organization of labor. Among the prisoners assigned to the workshops were women with prior experience in chemical work, metal processing, or precision labor. These skills made it possible to treat even factory waste as a potential resource, provided it was handled with meticulous caution. Still, any unapproved movement or error could be immediately detected. The factory layout was designed to make every operation transparent for supervision, but no system, however strict, was flawless. During production, unavoidable residues accumulated, small particles, dust, and fragments that were difficult to account for. These overlooked materials gradually became the foundation for bold ideas. Life in the women's camp operated according to its own unwritten rules. Information exchange, silent, discreet, and cautious, became essential for survival. Observations made at the factory were carefully evaluated and shared only when safe. The prisoners analyzed not only materials but also guard behavior, shifts in supervision, patterns of movement, and inspection routines. Over time, this produced a picture in which opportunities, however limited, still existed. In the months that followed, the internal structure of the group, informally calling themselves the technicians, became more organized. The women understood that access to production was only one part of a potential operation. They also needed a method for transporting the powder, a reliable way to hide it, and a strategy for minimizing trace evidence. The movement of each participant had to appear natural and consistent with camp routines. Meanwhile, the camp itself was transforming. Additional buildings were erected, the guard presence intensified, and regulations tightened. Reports from other parts of the complex confirmed a growing pressure on prisoners. The women working at the factory understood that their limited ability to act could disappear at any moment, making every detail increasingly significant. The camp's development and the worsening situation made the need for resistance clearer, even if the word itself was seldom spoken. The prisoners focused on practical steps, observation, analysis, and careful accumulation of knowledge necessary for actions that might later acquire meaning. The scale of danger accompanied every decision, but so did the understanding that hesitation carried its own risks. By the middle of 1943, gradual changes within the camp became increasingly noticeable to those forced to observe its inner workings day after day. New constructions, shifts in work assignments, the expansion of industrial areas, and strengthened supervision created an atmosphere in which every detail carried weight. The women assigned to the Union factory understood that their presence there resulted not only from labor needs but also from the growing demands caused by the continuation of the war. This allowed them to closely track fluctuations in routine and the evolving structure of factory work. Handling powder mixtures required precision and strict adherence to instructions. Although the prisoners performed tasks under coercion, the level of responsibility placed upon them resembled that expected from trained specialists. As weeks passed, the women became familiar with the rhythms of the factory, memorizing the timing of inspections, the behavior of guards, and the patterns in which tools and raw materials were checked. These observations were not part of a formalized plan, yet they created the groundwork for the analytical thinking that would eventually allow action. With each passing month, the prisoners gained a more detailed understanding of the facility's layout. They learned where materials were stored, which sections were most thoroughly monitored, and which areas offered the smallest chance of attracting attention. This knowledge allowed them to cautiously assess the practicality of collecting even minimal amounts of powder dust without arousing suspicion. Raw materials arrived in sacks and metal containers, while production waste was removed in small portions. The system of control appeared impenetrable at first glance, yet its routine nature revealed tiny gaps. Most women performed their tasks with extreme care, knowing that even a slight deviation from safety rules could result in severe accidents. This strict discipline unintentionally worked in their favor. Guards rarely suspected prisoners who consistently followed procedures. Over time, the group developed an unspoken understanding that their reliability could serve as cover for actions well beyond the framework of normal labor. Supervision at the factory intensified, especially in the afternoons, when inspections became more frequent. But in the early morning hours, during the first equipment checks and material loading, the guards' attention tended to scatter across numerous administrative tasks. The women noticed that these moments formed short but stable openings in which they could work with minimal risk of sudden oversight. These fragments of time, measured in seconds rather than minutes, became essential. The idea of secretly collecting powder developed slowly and rationally. The prisoners evaluated the properties of the fabrics used in the camp, the structure of their uniforms, and the possibility of trapping tiny particles inside seams or folds. Powder dust adhered to gloves and tools, settled onto sleeves or beneath equipment. Such insignificant traces, when collected systematically over weeks, could eventually become meaningful. The strategy relied on patience and absolute caution. By late July 1943, security measures in the camp intensified further, reflecting shifting conditions on the war fronts. This directly affected the factory as well, where additional inspections of equipment and prisoner behavior were introduced. The women adapted. updating their observations and accepting that access to materials might soon narrow. Paradoxically, stricter regulations sometimes made guards' routines more predictable, offering new insights into their behavior. At the same time, rumors of possible resistance efforts among male labor groups occasionally reached the women's camp. There were no concrete details, only hints and fragments carried between work brigades. Still, the women began to understand that the powder they collected might eventually support a larger plan. They had no direct contact with male workers and could not confirm such possibilities, but the growing responsibility strengthened their resolve. Some prisoners who once worked in scientific or industrial fields tried to recall the physical properties of different powder mixtures, their sensitivity to moisture, temperature, and pressure. Such knowledge allowed them to estimate how safely small quantities could be transported through the camp. The goal was not merely to collect powder, but to preserve it until a future recipient could apply it effectively. The women realized that actions needed to be sequential and discreet. Powder collection had to blend seamlessly with their daily routines, leaving no irregularities. Any slightest mistake could be interpreted as disobedience and lead to dire consequences. As the weeks passed, the need for discipline grew. The prisoners recognized that hesitation could result in the loss of their narrow window of opportunity, while careful persistence could eventually transform microscopic particles into a resource for resistance. The group no longer understood their effort as an isolated act. Instead, they saw themselves as participants in a process that could soon expand beyond their immediate experience. They did not know who might later use the powder or how it would be applied, but they understood that their meticulous work might someday contribute to an event whose scale they could only imagine. By early August 1943, the internal routines of the Union factory had become so familiar to the women involved in the covert collection of powder that they could predict many processes almost instinctively. This familiarity did not guarantee safety, but it reduced the unpredictability that defined daily life in the camp. Work with powder mixtures demanded complete concentration, and this requirement itself helped conceal their intentions. The women appeared fully absorbed in their assigned tasks, showing neither haste nor unusual interest in the remnants that accumulated on the machinery. The development of their plan unfolded gradually, without impulsive decisions. Each participant acted separately to avoid linking the entire group to any suspicious behavior. No explicit agreement existed, and the plan had never been spoken aloud. Instead, it emerged organically through shared observation and careful reasoning. Powder dust left on tools, clothing, and working surfaces became the basis for early collection efforts, although these quantities seemed insignificant at first. The women accepted that gathering meaningful amounts would require many weeks of persistence. They also studied which areas of the production line yielded the most waste material. Some sections were tightly monitored, while others accumulated powder dust naturally due to the design of the equipment. The prisoners noted how work intensity varied throughout the day, where guards appeared more fatigued and where supervision temporarily thinned. These insights allowed them to choose the safest moments to gather small portions of powder. Sometimes it was nothing more than residue caught on a sleeve or in the folds of a uniform. Yet even such tiny particles mattered when collected consistently. Meanwhile, the camp intensified its internal checks. Roll calls grew longer, and inspections inside the barracks became stricter. This forced the women to reconsider how they stored the collected powder. They sought hiding places that blended into daily life and avoided drawing attention. The underside of wooden bunks, concealed seams in clothing, layers of simple personal items. Each hiding place needed to be ordinary enough to pass inspection, but reliable enough to protect the powder from moisture or accidental loss. Rumors about male resistance efforts circulated more frequently, though no specifics could be confirmed. Still, the women increasingly believed that their powder collection might support a broader plan beyond the confines of the women's camp. They did not know the structure of the male underground, but the possibility strengthened their determination. It also placed greater weight on every decision, knowing that the material they preserved might one day serve a purpose. The factory faced changes of its own. Equipment was upgraded, creating noise and disarray that occasionally allowed small opportunities for discreet action. Such moments were never safe, but they introduced brief periods when the strict routine was disrupted just enough to shield subtle movements. The prisoners learned to recognize these rare conditions and to use them when possible. Storing the powder became a growing challenge. Winter's arrival would bring increased moisture, more movement within the barracks, and frequent surprise inspections. The women knew that their hiding places might soon become less secure. They experimented with more durable methods of preservation, focusing on materials that repelled dampness and could withstand handling. As the quantity of collected powder grew slowly, so did the risk of discovery. By September 1943, the camp introduced further security measures after reports of resistance elsewhere. Inspections became more thorough, forcing the women to reassess their routines. Some hiding spots had to be abandoned, while new ones were selected with greater care. Despite these difficulties, the collection continued at the factory. The women acted with practiced rhythm, always within the boundaries of permitted behavior, but with constant awareness of their hidden goal. They recognized that their collected powder had begun to accumulate into something meaningful, yet none of them allowed this to inspire confidence. Instead, it reinforced their caution. Every movement required precision. The stakes were no longer limited to gathering powder, but now extended to preserving it and planning its eventual transfer. By this stage, the women understood their work as part of a larger process, though they could not see its full scope. They accepted that the next phase would require even greater secrecy and discipline. They also understood that the opportunity to act might close without warning. This awareness compelled them to continue their efforts with unwavering steadiness, knowing that the most difficult decisions still lay ahead. By October 1943, the accumulated experience of the women involved in the powder collection allowed them to view their actions in a wider context. They still had no direct link to the male labor groups, yet the overall rhythm of the camp suggested that underground efforts were becoming more structured. These signs were subtle. Changes in the distribution of work assignments, increased security around certain locations, and occasional glimpses of prisoners engaged in construction near the crematorium sites. The women understood that such changes rarely occurred without reason and often reflected deeper processes underway. At the same time, storing the collected powder became increasingly difficult. The quantity had grown to a level that could no longer be kept individually by each participant. It became necessary to consolidate the material into a more compact and manageable form to ensure its preservation and eventual transfer. This required finding new hiding places, especially since existing ones no longer provided sufficient safety. The women selected locations that blended into their everyday environment: spaces beneath wooden bunks, concealed seams inside worn clothing, hidden pockets in common objects, or unused compartments for simple camp tools. These places had to appear naturally part of the surroundings, requiring no unusual behavior to access them. The Union factory continued to operate under rising pressure. Production intensified, shifts sometimes extended, and guards became increasingly preoccupied with managing the workload. Their focus on multiple tasks meant that supervision occasionally became more formal than attentive, creating small advantages for the prisoners. Even so, the danger remained constant. The women understood that their movements had to remain indistinguishable from routine, and each saved grain of powder had to look like an unnoticed byproduct of daily labor. The question of how to transfer the powder became more urgent. The women knew that storing it indefinitely within the barracks was impossible. They also understood that their efforts would be wasted if the powder did not reach those capable of using it. Yet the women's camp was isolated from the male zone, and opportunities for contact were extremely limited. Only rare moments during roll calls, work transitions, or intersecting routes allowed them to observe men who might be linked to underground organizing. Even these observations revealed nothing certain. Despite the obstacles, indirect channels for exchanging information existed within the camp. Certain work units responsible for cleaning, sorting items, or managing storage areas moved between zones and occasionally came into proximity with male labor groups. The women analyzed whether such units might serve as intermediaries without raising suspicion. But the risks were considerable. A single irregular movement or object out of place could trigger immediate alarm. Therefore, they focused on waiting for a moment when natural camp activity would allow their actions to blend seamlessly into regular tasks. As autumn progressed, internal pressure increased, inspections became more frequent, and the approaching winter meant more movement within overcrowded barracks. With each passing week, the risk of unplanned searches grew. The women understood that the powder could not remain hidden indefinitely. They accepted that they were approaching a turning point. Meanwhile, signs of organization among the male workers became increasingly evident, though still indirect. Changes occurred in work assignments near the crematorium area. Some men gained more frequent access to technical zones, a privilege granted only to those whose tasks were considered essential. This suggested ongoing surveillance of camp structures and routines. The women could not know the details, but they recognized that such groups would likely be the ones capable of using the powder effectively. Despite the heightened tension, opportunities for collecting small amounts of powder remained. Equipment failures, maintenance intervals, and the shifting attention of guards created brief openings. Over months of labor, the women learned to treat such moments not as accidents, but as natural features of the unpredictable environment. Their discipline strengthened with each new risk taken. By late November 1943, the situation had reached a point where further hesitation would endanger everything they had gathered. The powder had been consolidated, hidden, and protected under increasingly difficult conditions. It now represented not just material, but responsibility. The women understood they were approaching the moment when it would need to be transferred beyond the boundaries of their own camp sector. The decision was not spoken aloud, but they sensed it collectively. The next steps would be more dangerous than anything they had attempted before. Yet the women knew that delaying further could mean losing the narrow window of possibility they had worked for through months of risk and discipline. By December 1943, the task of transferring the collected powder had become the women's primary concern. They understood that continued accumulation only increased the risk of discovery and reduced the chances that the material would be used in time. In the environment of the camp, delays could easily result in wasted effort. They had already studied the daily routines of both the Union factory and the women's camp in detail, identifying which movements could serve as potential contact points, though knowledge alone did not guarantee success. What they needed was a method that combined invisibility, natural behavior, and minimal personal interaction. Winter brought increased activity around the camp. Prisoners were moved more often, spontaneous recounts were ordered, and cleaning teams worked longer hours on the grounds between camp sectors. These conditions offered more opportunities to observe the flow of labor and the movement of work brigades. The women noticed that certain units responsible for waste removal or storage duties had comparatively free access to areas near the male barracks. Their work involved handling numerous objects, which made it easier to transfer small items without attracting suspicion. Gradually, the women concluded that the most realistic transfer point was through work groups that managed the camp's storage facilities. These locations were less rigidly controlled and subject to fewer detailed inspections than the factory or construction areas. The women understood that any interaction must look like a natural extension of assigned tasks, so they focused their attention on moments when such tasks overlapped with their own. A critical step was consolidating the powder into a compact form suitable for transport. This had to be done discreetly within the barracks, where every unexpected sound or gesture could be noticed. The women fashioned a small container using worn cloth, carefully chosen to blend with common camp materials. The cloth was arranged to hold the powder securely despite the cold, humidity, and constant movement. Selecting a hiding place for the container required equal precision. It needed to be accessible, dry, and unremarkable enough to withstand spontaneous inspections. At the same time, tensions within the camp rose. The administration introduced new inspection routines, elongated roll calls, and stricter movement controls. The women sensed that external events beyond the camp might be influencing these decisions. They remained cautious, fully aware that any irregular behavior could undermine everything they had prepared. Signs of a more organized male underground became increasingly noticeable, though still indirect. Some laborers near the crematorium sites were reassigned to technical tasks that required steady access to sensitive areas. This shift seemed measured and purposeful. While the women did not know the scope of the men's plans, they recognized that such groups would be the most capable of using their collected powder. Further preparations focused on identifying guards' behavioral patterns. Winter cold often drove the guards to shorten outdoor inspections or to monitor labor brigades from sheltered vantage points. These habits created brief moments where certain routes within the camp were monitored less intensely. The women studied these intervals carefully. When guards changed shifts, how long recounts lasted, and how supply movements influenced overall attention. These details eventually formed a map of opportunity. By mid-January 1944, the women concluded that they could not postpone action much longer. The powder had reached a level of risk that made continued storage dangerous. Its safe transfer was the final step of their months of disciplined effort. They knew that the process had grown beyond their direct control and that the responsibility for using the material would soon shift to others. Their role was now to move the powder into position for someone else to carry forward. The moment finally emerged when a storage team received orders to transport old and worn items between two distant warehouses. The route they would take crossed an area with historically lighter guard presence. Additionally, the guards that day were occupied with an inspection elsewhere. The women recognized that such favorable conditions might not repeat. One participant, assigned to work near the storage area, discreetly placed the powder-filled cloth among a pile of worn garments marked for relocation. The container did not stand out in color or texture, blending seamlessly among the discarded items. Her movements were calm and consistent with routine sorting tasks. Nothing about her behavior indicated deviation. From a distance, the women watched as the storage unit moved through the camp. They could not intervene or verify the outcome. The transfer now depended on forces outside their reach. As the group passed through the lightly guarded area, a male prisoner briefly examined the transported items, a motion entirely typical for someone ensuring that the load was properly organized. Yet to the women observing, this indicated recognition and acceptance of the hidden material. When the team disappeared from view, the women understood that the transfer had taken place. They did not know where the powder would be taken next or who would handle it. Their work had reached its conclusion. What happened from this point onward would unfold in areas of the camp to which they had no access. Their task was complete, and the outcome now rested in the hands of others. By February 1944, the women who had collected the powder reached the stage that required absolute precision. Transferring the prepared material was now the decisive task that defined the purpose of all their previous months of work. Any mistake could endanger not only their own lives, but also the efforts of those who depended on receiving the powder. In the camp, even the slightest hint of coordination between different zones was considered a serious violation. For this reason, all actions were based on careful observation and the patient search for the right moment. The women concluded that the most realistic channel for the transfer lay within one of the camp's housekeeping brigades. These teams moved between storage areas, laundry facilities, and sorting points, giving them access to multiple sectors of the camp. Their work required handling various objects, which created natural opportunities for carrying small items unnoticed. The women studied the schedule of these brigades, observing when guards paid less attention to loads and how the responsibilities within the teams were distributed. Even small changes in the behavior of the supervisors could determine the choice of the transfer moment. One factor encouraging hope was the seasonal burden on staff. Winter forced guards to stay inside heated structures more often, shortening outdoor inspections and making them less thorough in cold weather. These conditions created brief intervals during which parts of the camp were only loosely monitored. The women understood that none of these moments were truly safe, but they represented the only available chance. A discreet and natural method for transporting the powder was required. For this purpose, the women prepared a small fabric container, shaped to resemble a piece of worn work clothing. The cloth was folded and stitched in such a way that it concealed the powder within a hidden pocket, remaining flexible and visually indistinguishable from common items found in storage areas. The goal was to design an object that guards could pick up or move without noticing its weight or structure. During their observations, the women identified one housekeeping brigade that regularly passed near areas where men assigned to technical duties around the crematoriums worked. These men, based on indirect signs, could be connected to underground activities. Their tasks granted them access to sensitive structures and allowed them to move through multiple sectors without extensive questioning. The women could not confirm whether they were part of an organized network, but this group represented the most plausible recipients of the powder. In mid-February, the opportunity they had been anticipating finally emerged. The housekeeping brigade was ordered to move items between two distant storage points. This would take them through a section of the camp with historically lighter guard presence. On that same day, guards were preoccupied with an inspection elsewhere. Their reduced mobility and divided attention made the conditions as favorable as possible. One of the women, assigned to work near the storage area, quietly inserted the cloth container into a pile of worn garments scheduled for transport. The movement appeared entirely routine. Sorting damaged clothing was part of her daily tasks, and her behavior showed no noticeable deviation. The container blended seamlessly among the other discarded materials. The women observed from afar as the brigade proceeded along its route. At this moment, their role was reduced to passive witnesses. They could not intervene or ensure success. The transfer depended entirely on external circumstances. As the group passed through the lightly watched zone, one male prisoner inspecting the load briefly glanced at the pile and adjusted it. This action seemed like an ordinary part of his work. Yet for the women, it signaled that the container had been recognized and accepted. When the brigade disappeared from sight, the women understood that the transfer phase was completed. They had no way of knowing where the powder was taken or who would handle it next. Their contribution was now fully out of their hands. They could only return to their daily routines and maintain the same level of caution, knowing that the consequences of their actions might unfold at any moment. They had fulfilled their part. The future use of the powder would depend entirely on those who now possessed access to the restricted parts of the camp. After the transfer of the powder, the women found themselves in the position of observers with no ability to influence what happened next. They did not know whose hands the material had entered, how it would be used, or what decisions those now responsible would make. Yet subtle signs began to appear throughout the camp, indicating that the powder had reached individuals capable of applying it. These indicators were faint, small shifts in the behavior of male labor groups, particularly those working near the crematorium areas and technical sites. The women noticed changes in the men's movements. Their routes became more direct, their work more coordinated, and their general behavior more restrained. Nothing resembled open disobedience, but there was a sense of purposeful calculation behind their actions. For the women, who had observed camp routines for months, these deviations did not seem accidental. They suggested that preparations were taking place, even if the exact nature of these preparations remained hidden. Meanwhile, the Union factory continued its relentless operations. The women returned to their usual tasks, ensuring they behaved precisely as they had before. They understood that any shift in their demeanor could raise suspicion. Their actions had to remain indistinguishable from the habits formed over months. The discipline they maintained had not only protected them during the powder collection, but now served as a shield, preventing any association with the transfer. In the men's camp, tension became more visible. Work brigades seemed increasingly fatigued, yet carried a quiet sense of resolve. They avoided unnecessary interaction with other prisoners, even through glances or gestures. When they returned from work, their silence appeared heavier than before, as though they carried knowledge that required absolute discretion. The women could see only fragments of this evolving atmosphere, but even these fragments revealed that something significant was forming beyond their reach. Rumors about resistance efforts in other camps filtered slowly into the women's barracks. These accounts were inconsistent and often distorted, but they contributed to a growing sense of movement beyond the camp's borders. Some said that prisoners elsewhere had attempted to sabotage equipment. Others mentioned isolated acts of defiance. The veracity of these reports could not be verified, yet they fueled a feeling that the system of camps was under increasing strain. The women wondered whether the powder they had collected would become part of a similar attempt. By March 1944, inspections throughout the camp intensified. Guards conducted more frequent searches of barracks and delayed work brigades for repeated counts. The women were aware that such measures could signal either heightened suspicion or broader concerns within the camp administration. They maintained their cautious routines, positioning themselves as disciplined, predictable workers whose behavior never deviated. At the factory, irregularities began increasing as well. Equipment was occasionally stopped for sudden checks, and guards received new instructions without explanation. Some members of the staff appeared more tense. Their steps became sharper, their remarks more abrupt. These were signs that something unsettled the administration. Whether it related to events inside or outside the camp was impossible to determine. From the women's perspective, their role in the hidden process had ended. The powder was out of their hands. They no longer had the ability to influence the direction events would take. All that remained was to observe and to remain unnoticed. Their internal tension grew, but they kept it contained, aware that any expression of concern might signal to guards that something was amiss. Camp overcrowding increased as more prisoners were assigned to factory labor. This added unpredictability to daily routines. On one hand, the influx of new workers made it easier for underground activities to blend into the noise and movement of crowded workspaces. On the other hand, increased congestion heightened the risk of accidental discoveries or unscheduled inspections. The women recognized both possibilities and understood that the male underground would have to adapt quickly. By late March, the camp atmosphere seemed to hover at a threshold. The women sensed that the structure of daily life was shifting, but not yet visibly. The men's routines, the guards' reactions, and the flow of work all suggested a tightening tension, as if the entire system was bracing for something. The women could only watch. They knew the powder was no longer in safe storage, but moving through channels they could no longer trace. They had become witnesses to a process now completely beyond their control. By April 1944, the atmosphere inside the camp carried a sense of concealed instability. Outwardly, nothing seemed unusual. The daily schedule remained unchanged. Labor brigades marched along familiar routes, and the Union factory continued its operations. Yet prisoners who had survived long enough in the camp recognized even minor deviations. The women who had gathered and transferred the powder were especially sensitive to such changes. They observed the camp with heightened caution, understanding that any detail could hint at the next stage of events connected to their efforts. The movements of male labor groups became more structured. Inspections around the crematorium areas grew more regular, and certain teams altered their routes for reasons that appeared administrative on the surface. But the women noticed that some of these changes occurred when guards were occupied elsewhere. To an untrained eye, the differences were insignificant. To those who had studied camp patterns for months, they suggested deliberate actions masked as daily routine. At the same time, guard pressure increased. Early in April, new rules for roll calls were introduced, making the process longer and stricter. Guards sometimes appeared unexpectedly near the barracks, conducting quick searches before leaving without explanation. Although these heightened measures caused anxiety, the women saw no indication that the guards possessed information about their specific involvement. The inspections felt broad and unfocused rather than targeted. This lack of precision offered a small reassurance. The women understood that the powder must still be hidden somewhere beyond their reach. They could no longer influence its fate. All they could do was remain unnoticed and continue to observe, understanding that the next phase belonged to others. Inside the factory, activity intensified. New shipments arrived nearly every day, and equipment ran continuously. The women returned to their tasks with disciplined focus, aware that their visible reliability was essential. Their prior role in the concealed effort had ended, yet memories of the collection process caused them to reconsider the potential effects of the powder. Those with chemical knowledge sometimes caught themselves calculating how such material could be used, whether to disable equipment, damage infrastructure, or create an opening for coordinated actions. Late April brought more visible signs of preparations among male prisoners. Some work brigades returned from their tasks more exhausted than usual, their faces marked with strain not fully explained by labor alone. Their movements grew more purposeful. They spoke little, avoided unnecessary contact, and behaved with a guarded awareness that suggested internal coordination. These changes were subtle, yet the women sensed intent behind them. Additional irregularities appeared in the daily routines of technically skilled male workers. They expanded their routes, gaining access to new locations. They worked with tools more frequently and moved in patterns that seemed designed for observation. No single action stood out, but taken together, they indicated that underground planning was reaching a mature phase. Despite these developments, the daily life of the camp maintained its outward rigidity. The women found themselves in a state of patient expectation. The collection and transfer of the powder had provided them with a purpose, a sense that they had contributed something meaningful. Now, their involvement was limited to continued vigilance. They lived within the tension of knowing something might occur without knowing when or how it would unfold. By early May, the sense of coordination among male labor groups became more pronounced. When two work brigades crossed paths, their movements were natural, yet subtly synchronized. The timing of their routes aligned in ways that seemed too precise to be accidental. Their interactions were brief, restrained, and carefully unobtrusive. The women, watching from a distance, recognized these patterns as preparation, the kind that required planning, discipline, and risk. For the women, this period became one of reflection. They understood that their months of collecting powder had been a small but essential part of something larger. In a place designed to extinguish hope, any act of resistance required extraordinary resolve. Even though they no longer played an active role, they sensed that their contribution remained present in the unfolding events. By the time the underground network moved toward a critical stage, the women no longer had the means to trace its progress. They were separated from the men who now held the powder and from the places where decisive actions might soon occur. The future was uncertain, shaped by forces outside their visibility. Yet they knew one thing with certainty: they had done everything within their power. Their work, though invisible, had become a thread woven into a hidden history of resistance, a history built on countless risks taken in silence, under constant threat by those who refused to surrender entirely to the machinery around them.